Namaste and good afternoon. A hearty welcome to Sahitya Akademi's Webline Literature Series. Under this series, in this particular segment, we will have a seminar on non-fiction writings of Premchand. We have with us to present their papers as well as share their views Professor Dr. Harish Trivedi ji, Professor Dr. M. Asaduddin ji, Dr. Malati Mathur ji, Dr. Mini Nanda ji, and Dr. Shoaib Akram ji. Professor Dr. Amina Ansari ji will chair this seminar. I now request the chair, Professor Dr. Amina Ansari ji, to please open the session for presentations. Amina ji is currently professor at Jamia Millia Islamia as Department of English, holding a doctorate on Canadian literature with specific reference to the evolution of literary canon. Professor Ansari ji's areas of academic interest and publication are literary translation, post-colonial writing, and resistance literature. She has authored English Canadian Literary Canon, Emergence and Development, co-edited Translation, Representation, and Indian English Women Poets, and has done English translations of Urdu short stories as well as Kamleshwar's Hindi novel, Kitne Pakistan. Her translational endeavors have also included documentary film subtitling, and Moti Baag, subtitled by her, was awarded first prize for Best Long Documentary at the 12th International Documentary and Short Film Festival, Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala, and was India's documentary entry for the 2019 Oscar Awards. Another subtitled documentary, Dreaming Taj Mahal, won the Silver Conch in the international section at the 2012 Mumbai International Film Festival. In 2007, she was nominated by the United States government for the International Visitors Leadership Program. Hearty welcome, Amina ji.
Thank you very much for your very warm welcome this afternoon. We'll start the session immediately, and I would request, therefore, that a brief introduction to our presenters for this afternoon be made in the order of the presentation that they will be giving. So thank you, and now for the introductions of our paper presenters. Please.
As I told, we have with us scholars, critics, writers, poets, to discuss, to present papers, and to share views on non-fiction writings of Premchand at this seminar are Professor M. Asaduddin ji, who is an author, critic, and translator in several languages, who writes on literature, language politics, and translation studies. He is currently Dean, Faculty of Humanities and Languages, Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and advisor to the Vice Chancellor. He was Fulbright Scholar in Residence at Rutgers University, New Jersey, United States of America during 2008 and 2009. Earlier, he was a Charles Wallace Trust Fellow at the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, United Kingdom in 2000. He has lectured and led workshops at the universities of India and abroad. Among his books related to Premchand are Complete Premchand Stories, Premchand in World Languages, Filming Fiction, Tagore, Premchand, and Ray. Asaduddin ji is the chair, Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. He has received the following prizes for his translation: Katha Award, Dr. A.K. Ramanujan Award, Sahitya Akademi Prize for Translation, and Crossword Book Award. Welcome, Asaduddin ji. Could you please unmute yourself first?
I could see Professor Harish Trivedi there.
Yes, now he has joined.
So can we begin with him? It will be in the fitness of things to begin with.
Okay. Amina ma'am, is that okay?
It's
Could we
perfect.
first invite Professor Trivedi ji?
Yes, now that Harish ji has joined, I think
Yeah, he has joined in.
that you introduce him and proceed further after that.
Sure, sure. Professor Harish Trivedi ji, former professor of English at the University of Delhi, was visiting professor at Chicago, London, Istanbul, Peking, and Melbourne. Author of Colonial Transactions, English Literature in India, he has co-edited Kipling in India, Literature and Nation, and Post-Colonial Translation. He translated into English the Sahitya Akademi Award-winning biography of Premchand by Amrit Rai, and has published several articles on Premchand in both English and Hindi. Professor Trivedi ji. Oh, he seems to be facing net connectivity problem.
I cannot hear anything.
Yeah. Perhaps net connectivity problem recurring. Oh, okay. Amina ma'am, could we give Trivedi sir a little more time?
I think we just have to if the...
And we begin with Asaduddin sir. In the meanwhile, we phone Mr. Trivedi and talk to him.
Yes, because connectivity seems to be
Yeah.
the bad just as far as Professor Trivedi is concerned. So let's go ahead with Professor Asaduddin.
Yeah. Asaduddin sir, please.
Thank you. Good evening to the chair and all the other panelists and the organizers. I really wished that Professor Trivedi would provide an overview, as he only is capable of giving an overview on Premchand. And then we could perhaps pick up segments of Premchand's non-fiction. But we have to live with these technical difficulties. So for today, what I want to do is to pick up a very rare essay of Premchand and then use it as a peg to hang some of my observations and reflections on Premchand's deep and abiding concern about Hindu-Muslim relationship in India. The title of the essay is Islami Saibata, Islamic Civilization. I'm not sure whether it is easily available. Dr. Kamal Kishore Goenka, the famous researcher on Premchand, on one of his visits to Jamia, had presented it to me, and this is in his own handwriting. What I'll do, I'll just read out the opening paragraph to give the audience a flavor of the original, and then I'll move on to other things. There, one point we have to keep in mind, that there cannot be any compartmentalization between fictional works and non-fictional works of Premchand, because the boundary is very porous. One illuminates another, one reinforces another, and one can see that he will pick up the same theme and deal the same theme both in his fictional and non-fictional writing. So one very useful way of dealing with the themes perhaps is to see how he deals with those themes in both his fictional and non-fictional writing. So I'm taking his non-fictional essay as just a take of point. And in my discussion, of course, both fiction and non-fiction will come. The title of the essay, Islami Sahitya Premchand. This was published in the weekly Pratap in December 1925. The date is important because I allude to this date later. This is the opening paragraph. हिंदू और मुसलमान दोनों 1000 वर्षों से हिंदुस्तान में रहते चले आते हैं, लेकिन अभी तक एक दूसरे को समझ नहीं सके। हिंदू के लिए मुसलमान एक रहस्य है, मुसलमान के लिए हिंदू एक मुअम्मा। ना हिंदू को इतनी फुर्सत है कि इस्लाम के तत्वों की छानबीन करे, ना मुसलमान को इतनी अवकाश है कि हिंदू धर्म तत्वों के सागर में बूते लगाए। दोनों एक दूसरे के बारे में बेसिर पैर की बातों की कल्पना करके माथा फुटोल करने पर आमादा रहते हैं। हिंदू समझता है दुनिया भर की बुराइयां मुसलमानों में भरी हुई हैं, इनमें ना दया है, ना धर्म, ना सदाचार, ना संयम। मुसलमान समझता है हिंदू पत्थरों को पूजने वाला, गर्दन में धागे डालने वाला, माथा रांगने वाला और दाल भात खाने वाला एक पशु है। दोनों एक दूसरे के साये से बचते हैं और दोनों दलों के जो बड़े से बड़े धर्माचार्य है वो इस भेदभाव में सबसे आगे है। मानव द्वेष और विरोधी धर्म का प्रधान लक्ष्मण है। हम इस समय हिंदू मुस्लिम वैमनस्य पर कुछ नहीं कहना चाहते हैं। मौलाना शौकत अली के साथ हमारा भी ये विश्वास है कि ये दशा अस्थायी है और वो समय दूर नहीं है जब हिंदू और मुसलमान दोनों अपनी गलती पर पछतावेंगे और अगर मनुष्यता और सज्जनता से प्रेरित होकर नहीं तो आत्मरक्षा के लिए संयुक्त होना आवश्यक समझेंगे। हम इस समय केवल ये देखना चाहते हैं कि हिंदुओं को मुसलमानों की सभ्यता के विषय में जो धारणा है वो कहाँ तक सही है। This is the opening paragraph. What Premchand does in the rest of the essay is to pick out several ideals of Islam, like egalitarianism, pursuit of knowledge, administration of justice, rights of women, ideals of service, etc. He compares Islamic civilization with other great civilizations of the world and points out how Islam had a pioneering reformist role in several realms of human life. For example, he stresses that the watchwords of the French Revolution and its ideal were proclaimed by Islam several centuries earlier. Now, the question is why Premchand felt so strongly the need to explore Islamic history and civilization and dispel misunderstanding between Hindus and Muslims. We should know that this was not a passing concern with Premchand, but a continuing thread in his fictional and non-fictional writings. Around the same time that he wrote this essay, he wrote a full-length play with the title Karbala. He wrote Karbala in 1924. He wrote this essay in 1925. Wrote this play Karbala to promote amity and understanding between Hindus and Muslims. It created some controversy, but Premchand stood steadfast in his unwavering belief in the cause of Hindu-Muslim unity. Indeed, right from his first collection of stories, Suze Watan, where a story with the title Sheikh Mahmood chronicles the life and the supreme sacrifice of a Muslim patriot for his country, and then through his 300 odd stories and 14 novels, one important strand that many will find is Premchand's deep concern about Hindu-Muslim relationship, on which he thought depended the prosperity of the nation. I'd like to read this essay in the context of Premchand's ideas and ideals of nationalism and patriotism as evident in several of his fictional and non-fictional writings. We know that the entire corpus of Premchand, fiction, non-fiction, is animated by the deep love for the country, patriotism, and nationalism. At this point, let me ask the question: what were the constituting elements of Premchand's patriotism and nationalism? What were the essential ingredients? To me, there were two dominant elements, and they are social equity and social harmony. He was deeply and instinctively committed to social reform and against injustice of any kind. No other writer in Hindi or Urdu at his time and ever since has spoken so eloquently and effectively against social injustice. His stories, Thakur Ka Kuan, Sawasar Gehu, Kafan, and several others constitute a devastating indictment of the way upper class have treated the underdogs for centuries. During the freedom movement, there was a school of thought that believed that the fissures within the Indian society had better be muted or glossed over till the country attained independence. Once the country got independence, the internal problems could be resolved. With his writerly insight into human nature, Premchand knew that it was a specious argument. He believed that unless social inequities were removed and people were educated and made self-aware, one class of rulers would be replaced by another class without any substantial change in the condition of the ordinary people. To the illiterate, exploited, and disenfranchised masses, the word nationalism itself would be meaningless. Premchand faced head-on the duality between nation and class, an inescapable confrontation in a colonial situation, which many other writers tended to ignore or chose to defer its resolution to a later date. In his hard-hitting article, Are We True Nationalists?, published in Jagaran 8 January 1934, Premchand expressed his views forcefully that the first condition of nationalism is the strengthening of a feeling of equality in society. Sorry. He goes so far as to assert that it was impossible even to imagine nationalism without it. In the story Tyag, through the conversation between Roopmati and Anand, Premchand poignantly articulates his anxieties about the plight of the underclass, even after the attainment of Swaraj. I leave the illustrations, and I'm sorry for this spasm of cough, which I can't control. I'll go to the next constituent. The other constituent of Premchand's nationalism was social harmony. Belief in pluralism, India's composite culture, religious and linguistic diversity, and the concept of shared history and collective destiny were all inalienable parts of his idea of Indian nationalism. He was deeply interested and invested in a cordial relationship between Hindus and Muslims, a fact which is evident in both his fictional and non-fictional writings. He had no doubt that the independence and progress of the country depended substantially on the harmonious relationship between these two dominant religious groups in India. Early in his life, he was introduced to Muslim culture in Islam through learning Persian and Urdu, through the Maulvi who taught him. He was also familiar with the ideals of Hinduism, both the orthodox variety and the reformist trend of Arya Samaj, to which his family owed allegiance. This, coupled with his inherently secular temperament, provided him a unique vantage point from which he could write fairly and fearlessly about both the communities in an even-handed way. In fact, he was the only writer of his generation in any Indian language, not excepting Bankim, Tagore, or Sharat Chandra Chatterjee, to write about the external and internal lives of the members of both the communities and their interconnectedness with a kind of insight, empathy, and intimacy that have not been matched since. This is an important point I want to stress. Many non-Muslim writers, they have written about Muslims and the Muslim community. But often you feel that they have tried to look at the community externally because they didn't have the wherewithal to know the internal lives of the people of the community, which is very difficult. And this is where the distinction of Premchand lies. One cannot think of any other Indian writer who possessed that kind of double vision. During his lifetime, the relationship between Hindus and Muslims went through particularly volatile and turbulent phases, as it is today. But he was unwavering in his belief in pluralism and kept his faith till the end. Studies like Panch Parameshwar, Idgah, Haj-e Akbar, Mandira or Masjid, Nabi Ka Niti Nirvaha, Shama, and essays such as this one, Islamic Saibbatha, and a couple of others, demonstrate how deeply he knew about Islamic culture and the intimate lives of Muslim families, and how the daily lives of the Hindus and the Muslims were intertwined, particularly in the countryside. Towards the end of the second decade of the 20th century, when the Hindu-Muslim relation was at the lowest ebb, Premchand wrote his play Karbala, as I mentioned earlier, on a deeply emotional subject for Muslims, to cement the bonds of Hindu-Muslim unity. In several stories and novels, he shows how Hindus and Muslims were equally inspired by the Gandhian ideals and fought for independence together. In fact, he was so similar with the other frail man who provided inspiration, that is Mahatma Gandhi, who provided inspiration to him and who in a way sacrificed his life on this mission of establishing amity between Hindus and Muslims. Premchand seems immensely relevant in today's India when history is being sought to be rewritten and Muslims are being constantly cast in the role of the other and made accountable for all the real and imagined atrocities of the Muslim rulers of the past. In his own time, he saw with bewilderment how and this I quote from Premchand, "Whenever a Muslim king is remembered, we evoke Aurangzeb." A remark that reverberates with contemporary resonance, indicating the agenda of some people who always sought to frustrate any attempt at a broader understanding and reconciliation between these two communities. He was opposed to religious sectarianism and orthodoxy in any form. This will be evident if one reads his stories of the Muhtaram series and a story like Jihad. This is a very interesting story with contemporary relevance, with Afghanistan as its setting, which seems almost prophetic, where he anticipates what goes today by the misleading and erroneous name of Islamic Jihad. There is not a shred of doubt that phenomena such as mob lynching, Ghar Wapasi, Love Jihad, etc., would have been deeply repugnant to him. And he would have stood steadfastly against them. He would have been deeply saddened to see the gradual demise of an inclusive, forward-looking, emancipatory nationalism, giving way to some kind of parochial, divisive, and regressive jingoism. Thank you, and I'm sorry I had to skip portions because of the cough that has been bothering me. But in my paper, you will have all those segments. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Amina ma'am, please unmute yourself. Amina ma'am, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Akademi. And I do hope you're taking some medication for your cough, because it really did, make you have difficulties. Thank you very much for taking up a viewpoint that has to do with Premchand's fiction and non-fictional writings. Very illustrative. And I request that we go on to the next presenter. I hope that Professor Trivedi is able to join us now.
Professor Trivedi has been trying to join in. I talked to him and he told that he would use his cell phone to join in, but he is still unable perhaps. Let us see. Hello.
Okay. Can we just try and check out if he will join us?
How can you hear me?
Hello.
Professor Trivedi ji.
No, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I can't hear him.
Yes.
See. Okay.
Again, because I think there are two of them. Harish is.
On my screen, his name is visible, but he is not, unfortunately.
There are two of Harish at the moment. Neither of them visible or audible.
Yeah.
So can
Okay,
we
let us.
go to the next
Yeah.
Professor Trivedi in a bit?
No, but he is trying his best.
So let's go on to the next presenter.
Sure. What we can do is we can invite Malti ji
Right.
to present. Okay.
Request Professor Malti Mathu.
Yeah. Professor Malti Mathu ji is a poet, writer, and professor of English and director, School of Humanities, IGNOU, New Delhi. She has a PhD in Australian literature and has taught language and literature for over 3 decades. She translates between Tamil, Hindi, and English, and is a recipient of 3 Katha British Council Awards for translation. She is passionate about music and has a degree in sitar. She has published extensively and participated in a number of conferences in India and abroad. Some research interests are women's writing, Indian writing in English, and translation, obviously. Her publications include Affinities, Merging Meridians, Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, The Jodhpur Years, Remembering Amma, and Reformatory. Welcome, Malti-ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I hope I am clearly audible.
Yeah, you are.
Thank you. Well, I think at the very outset, I need to confess that I am not a scholar of Premchand, and especially because Hindi is not my mother tongue, and I came to Hindi very, very late in life. So Premchand, maybe for Hindi-speaking people, is part of their collective consciousness in many ways, having read Premchand throughout their school and college years, perhaps. So I did not have that great good fortune. I have read Premchand's fiction at a much later stage in my life, and the non-fiction, of course, came even later than that. So when I got this invitation from the Sahitya Akademi, I was greatly intrigued because most of us know Premchand through his fiction, his novels, his short stories, Karbala, his drama, and I was wondering what I should speak on and how much of non-fiction did Premchand write anyway. And I was in for a huge surprise because when I started delving into my library, I found that there are volumes of letters, not just exchanged between Premchand and others, but between contemporaries, Premchand's contemporaries, who exchange letters between themselves, which also reflect the kind of society and the kind of fulmination and the kind of thinking that was going on regarding the literary scene. And of course, there are a number of prefaces and introductions and all those, the bhumikas and all of that. So basically what I'm going to talk about is his letters, what the kind of glimpses that I got of Premchand through his letters. So I have focused purely on the letters that he has written or others have written to him. And I have sort of ignored the contemporary writers writing to themselves, in between themselves. And I'm greatly indebted to Shri Mangal Murthy, who has compiled and edited this book, Premchand, I think it is Premchand Patron Mein. So Mangal Murthy has compiled and edited it, and it gives this very fascinating view of the life of that time. And one of the things that greatly intrigued me, and which I hope that others will throw light on, and especially when Harish Trivedi makes his appearance and is able to make himself audible, is I was wondering why the Hindi world claims Premchand as their own. Because when I read his letters, there was so much of Urdu in the language that he uses, and he uses it with such felicity. He uses it so naturally and spontaneously that I kept wondering, I said, how can he be just a Hindi writer? Why does the Urdu literary world not claim Premchand as their own? Because I see that when we celebrate Premchand Jayanti, it's usually the Hindi faculty or the Hindi departments of various universities which celebrate this great writer. Why don't, I mean, I may be ignorant, please pardon that, but I'm not aware of Urdu departments celebrating Premchand Jayanti in any way, which I think is a pity because of the kind of Urdu that he exhibits and which makes him so much more readable. Because if, if he had written in chaste Hindi or chaste Urdu for that matter, he might not have been so accessible to people as he is even today. So that was something that I hope that the others on this panel can talk about as well. I mean, if for nothing to dispel my ignorance on this topic. And another thing that that struck me was how in some of his letters he signs off as Danpat Rai. And in some of them, he signs off as Premchand. So that was something that I didn't really understand, because he was writing personal letters, and sometimes, and to the same person, sometimes he was Dhanpatrai and sometimes he was Premchand. And then sometimes he would write as Sampadak Premchand, because he was also running the Saraswati Press and he was bringing out Hans and all of that. So the Sampadak Premchand and Dhanpatrai, I was trying to reconcile these three persona. And I really did not see any kind of a distinction between these three from the tone or the language or the tenor of his letters. So that intrigued me as well. And again, pleading my ignorance and my not having this great background, I would love it if somebody could also talk about that, or at least let me know why there was this kind of a signing off that was so different in the same kind of letters and to the same kind of people that he was writing to. And some of the things that he writes about, he was writing to all the literary giants of that time. He was writing to Jayashankar Prasad, he was writing to Pravassilal Verma, who was bringing out Hans. Later on, he was given the entire charge. He was writing to Shiv Pujan Sahai. And there is such a mix of topics in his letters. He not only brings in personal feelings, he asks them about their personal lives. He talks about his own worries, his, what is happening within his family. But he's also at the same time talking about what he's writing. He's talking about Hans, he's talking about the press, and he's pleading with people to, asking them to send in their writing so that it can be published. And there is also his worry for the Hindi literary scene. So all these things mixed together, and it's rather strange that, it's not as though he puts it into separate paragraphs. They're all jumbled up together. So in one breath, he may be talking about, please send me something for the next issue of Hans. And in the very next breath, he says something about, looking for a marriage alliance for his daughter. So that was something, again, that I found extremely interesting, because I don't know if that was how his mind flowed along. I don't know, it's fashionable to call it stream of consciousness, which came much later. But then I don't know if that was how, that was the key to his creativity, perhaps. So the kind of issues that he talks about, which I've already mentioned, is, of course, one of the greatest concerns that he had was how to get Hans going. And there are so many instances where he talks about how the Hans has to start flying now. And he is constantly asking his friends to contribute pieces, and he says, the deadline has gone, we have to bring it out, we are already late. And then he says, I liked this particular piece of yours, and I'm going to take it, and very humbly asking for permission to use it. And he says, if you do not respond in time, then I am going to just take it, and you can't complain to me. So there is this wonderful mix of humility and the kind of the kind of authority that one usually displays with close friends, where that they will not take offense at something that you have said, or that something that you can just take this kind of liberty with them. So there is a lot of humility. He invariably begins his letters to Shiv Pujan Sahai with Vande. And, all the time talking about Kripa and your Ashirvad, things of that kind. So that kind of the Sanskriti or the Sanskar that we talk about, it is on full display. But at the same time, there is this, as a publisher, as somebody who's bringing out a journal, there is this kind of pleading to please send in contributions. But at the same time, as a friend, as a contemporary, as a writer himself, who has a certain standing in the literary world, there is also that sense of authority that comes in without being too dominant. So it's not as though he's being arrogant in any way. That never comes in. It is more a friendly kind of authority that he exercises. And all the time, you can feel this great, great concern that he has about what the Hindi literary scene now needs. And he is constantly talking about various stories, various pieces that have appeared. He writes to Banarsi Das ji and he says, I know a certain, interview has appeared and which has hurt you immeasurably because that person has said a lot of nonsense about you, but then you must just ignore all of that. He says, because if you are going to give it any kind of importance, if you're going to even sort of take cognizance of it, then you are actually encouraging that kind of behavior or that kind of scurrilous writing. So just forget about it and concentrate on what you should be doing. So that is a great piece of advice that he gives to his contemporary writers. And in his letters to Pravasi Lal Verma regarding publication of Hans, he's totally businesslike. He says, this is the amount of money that comes in. This is how we are going to distribute the profits. These are the other partners. And how do we go about it every month? What is it that you need? What is the kind of business that we need? That you have to go talk to people. You have to bring in the business. You have to do a lot of the running around. You have to bring that in. And then whatever profits are there, then we will share it amongst ourselves. And he sets it down in a very, very clear-cut manner. And then he says that take this as the contract. This letter is the contract. And amongst friends, we should have this kind of a trust, and we will continue with this. So that is another side of Premchand that I saw in his letters. This businessman, the man who is running the press, which is running at a huge loss, unfortunately, and bringing out the fledgling Hans, which later on, of course, became such a prestigious journal, and how he is struggling to bring it out, how he's struggling to keep them both afloat, and trying all his contacts to see how he could possibly make it into something that is solidly literary, something that people would read, and actually something that would be recognized as a good journal. And then there are those little snippets when he talks about how his own stories have been translated into Japanese. And there is a little sense of self-congratulation, which is so endearing. And he says that I believe that this was, somebody has communicated it to him and said that this has caused a sensation in Japan. So your stories are the sensation this week or something like that. And there is he is not boasting. He is not sort of basking in that and trying to put across his own greatness. But then the natural satisfaction and the happiness that one might feel at this kind of recognition of one's literary efforts, that comes across so clearly. And as I said, it's so endearing. It's absolutely endearing. And then he is also talking about the literary creations of other people and mentioning their stories or novels or anything that have come out, and actually saying, I like this and I like that. And also of his own writing, he says, I thank you for saying that you like this of mine. I also like it, his own story. And a lot of the social, the atmosphere can also be seen, though not so very predominantly, because of the little snippets that he brings in of his personal life. For instance, when he writes to Sahitya and he says, you have lost a child and I can sympathize with you. I know exactly how you feel because I myself have lost 2 children to Shitla, to smallpox. And just that one sentence immediately makes you understand what it must have been like at that point of time when smallpox was such a dreaded disease. when it was a pestilence, and there were so many people who were afflicted, and it was almost a fatal disease, and there were people who were blinded and that kind of thing. So for this generation, which now is free of smallpox, to read that and to try to understand what it must have been like to lose children to that kind of a pestilence, maybe there can be some kind of an equivalence with our COVID days. So that also comes across in his letters. And one that I found a little amusing, trifle amusing, was Sahai lost his wife. And then through another letter, Premchand is informed that he is going to remarry. And then he writes a letter to Sahai saying that I got to know that you've fallen down and you hurt your leg very badly. And he says, "Bahut khoob." And that took me by surprise. And I said, this man has, fallen down and injured his leg. And is this how Premchand reacts to it? By saying, "Bahut khoob." And then the next line sets it very clear. And he says, "Abhi to maine suna tha ki aap banna banne ja rahe hain." So, you are actually going to become a dulha, and what is this that you've done to yourself? So you better look after yourself. So that kind of a bantering, which was, which I found very amusing, and I found it very interesting, because not all his letters have this. He's not teasing, he's not pulling anyone's leg. So, but now and then, when you have those glimpses, then I think that focus more on Premchand as an individual. So by and large, he comes across in his letters as quite a serious kind of an individual. And he also shares his own personal worries. For instance, he's looking for a match for his daughter. And there are a number of letters that are exchanged where there is a particular person who is mentioned, but unfortunately that alliance doesn't work out. But then again, he asks a number of questions to the person who has suggested this alliance. And he says, how far is he educated? And one very interesting thing, how far is his home from the railway station? So that, again, I found quite intriguing, because I suppose in that time and age, perhaps without proper transport, perhaps people had to go by bullock carts. So that must have been a very pertinent question. And then he says, does he have any kind of bad habits? And how many brothers and sisters does he have? What is the kind of house that he lives in? What is their financial status? So those kind of questions. And in the same letter, he's also talking about Hans. He's also talking about sending literary pieces. So it is all mixed up together. So there were so many things that must have been jostling in his mind, the personal mixed up with the professional, and where do you draw the line? Because for him, I think the Hans was as personal as it was professional. I suppose the desire to see his daughter married into a good family, to a good person, was as valid or as intense as his desire to see Hans take off as a great literary creation. So in that sense, I suppose he also looked at Hans as one of his own children, which needs to be guided, which needs to be protected, and which needs to go out into the world to make a name for itself. So that is the kind of a feeling that I got when I read this, because otherwise, how do you explain why you would mix up the personal and the so-called professional interests, unless the professional was also the personal? So that was something that I found interesting, and which I thought was also a reflection on Premchand himself and on his personality. And he also talks about the Hindi film industry. And he says that he has received letters, they are asking him to come and contribute, but he says, "Main to kuch janta nahi hu Hindi film industry ke bare mein." So if there is someone who can come and talk to me about it, if there is someone who can give me some knowledge about it, maybe I can do something. So again, that kind of humility, which is so sorely lacking in so many people who have achieved even a little bit. So that is another very endearing quality that I found. And I think that's about all that I gathered from his letters. And as I said very early on, initially, I am not a scholar on Premchand, and I do not claim to have read all his letters or all his contemporary letters, but the ones that I did read, this is the kind of impression that I got of Premchand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Malti Mathur. That was another interesting facet that you took up, Premchand's correspondence and how he has addressed so many different and various issues. I request now for the third presentation to be preceded by the introduction to the speaker for the present.
Yeah, we will now invite Dr. Mini Nandaji. Miniji taught English for 3 decades in the Department of English, University of Rajasthan, Jaipur. In the course of her career, she has been the head of the department and a member of the University Senate. She edited a manuscript with translated works from 6 languages under the aegis of the Sahitya Akademi and co-edited a book titled Literary Constructs of the Self, with contributions from authors in India and abroad. She has been invited as resource person to various universities and conferences in India and abroad. Her academic writing, with over 40 published papers spanning cultural studies, film studies, women's writing, Indian, South Asian, Canadian, Caribbean, and Latin American literatures. After her superannuation, she keeps busy with academic commitments, translations, reading, and music. Welcome, Dr. Mini Nandaji. Please unmute yourself first.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank the organizers for giving me this wonderful chance to listen to this eminent panel. We are still waiting for Professor Trivedi's lecture. And the title of my paper would be Premchand's Abiding Legacy of Humanism. Dhanpat Rai Srivastav. His initial pen name was Nawab Rai. His collection of 5 stories, Soze Watan, in 1908 was published by Zamana Press. It was banned by the British as seditious. In order to continue writing, Premchand, he changed his name to Premchand. In 1921, Premchand first met Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi in Gorakhpur, and on the Mahatma's call for civil disobedience, he quit his job as Deputy Inspector of Schools and shifted to Varanasi. In 1923, he set up his publishing house, which Professor Malti Mathur was talking about, the worry to keep it afloat, both Saraswati Press, and in 1930, he launched the magazine Hans. Shivrani Devi, Premchand's wife, in the works Premchand Ghar Mein, shares the fact that he always anguished about the plight of the peasants and felt a special affinity with all the workers who wielded the spade and dedicated his pen to their cause. The cultural movement of the time was rooted in the ideas of social realism. Premchand shed a lot of ground, as mentioned earlier by Professor Saudit, with that frail man, with Gandhiji on certain ideas. But as Sudeep Chandra observes pertinently, Premchand believed in Adarshmukhi Yatharthvad, idealistic realism, which would gauge, and he could gauge the grim situation of the peasants, the Kisan, even after the end of the Raj, on which he reflected in most of his writings. In his essay, Who Will Benefit from Swaraj, published in the April edition of Hans in 1930, Premchand observes that there are some people who are filled with fear and apprehension that Swaraj would not benefit them. They are mainly the zamindars, the money lenders, and the rich. The farmers were the only group who did not have the support of a union. Swaraj aimed to put an end to all oppression and inequality. Premchand exhorted all the people who believed in justice and truth to support the movement. Gandhiji's salt satyagraha is extolled in the essay Fight for Freedom, when he says on 6th April 1930, on the seashore of Dandi, Gandhi struck a deadly blow on the foundation of imperialism and colonialism. Its echo reverberated all over the country. He says we have been paying the salt tax for the last 150 years, which is 10 times the price. Swaraj is the only answer to all our problems and answer to all our prayers. Salt law has been broken. The government is shaken by the movement. In all his works, we see that Premchand writes the historiography of his times, dealing with the life and philosophy of the marginalized who have been absent from the annals of national history. In his writings, the abiding quality, as mentioned by earlier panelists, is one of deep humanism that embraces all classes and castes and reflects the varied views of lived reality. Ranajit Guha avers that historians must leap over the fence of history and go into the greener pastures of literature to create a historiography of the quotidian. In Premchand's non-fictional writing, we get the sharp, incisive perspective of lived, pulsating, everyday history. Of all the pervasive suppressive role of the government, we have the essay Oppression. The national movement is perceived as a visible awakening of the Indian soul. Gandhi is the embodiment of that awakening. By incarcerating the Mahatma, Premchand notes, the imperial government has proved that it is a colonial regime where even the most noble soul cannot live in freedom. And sooner such an imperial, unjust regime is wiped out, the better, he says, it is for India and for the world. Thus, by focusing on the local and the, uh, oppressive image is at once made global and sounds the clarion call to erase all forms of oppression. Elaborating on the Secretary of State Wedgwood Benn's dismissive statement that the farmers and the Muslims are not participating in the revolt, Premchand wonders if Wedgwood is such a simpleton. The movement aims at the betterment of the farmers to ease their economic burden. The Mahatma himself has called the farmers the horse of the movement. Premchand's riposte to the divisive aspect of Wedgwood is that Peshawar is a Muslim city and all our Muslim brothers have faced the oppression and it has opened their eyes. Does it behove the British government to deliberate on whether who is participating and who is not instead of focusing on the main issues? The heartless manner in which the movement is suppressed on the pretext of law and order shows that the government is shaken and trying to beat down the movement with baton. Premchand shares Bernard Shaw's message to all the Indians regarding their struggle for Swaraj. In the essay, India will take its own decision. George Bernard Shaw, a Fabian socialist who believed in democracy as an evolutionary form of social justice, confirmed that the Indian situation has to be addressed by Indians themselves. When they are fighting the British, he warned, do not look for help from any foreign country. They will not raise a finger. They will not lift a finger. And in his own Shavian style, blunt, he said, once you get your rule, because England is a very small part of the British Union, it will move away from India. So once the English move away, you will have to focus on organizing your state. And then he says, that time, public speeches should be made punishable by hanging. To show, Premchand, in his ironic mode, summarizes Shaw's warning and says that oratory is the basis of any leadership. If one is a good orator, however selfish or proud he may be, he rises as the leader of the nation. The world believes that eloquence of speech translates naturally to efficiency at work, which Premchand notes may not be the case. On the practice of atonement after travel abroad, Premchand scoffs at the hypocrisy where India is considered a spiritual center, and in the past sages have gone abroad and brought glory to the nation and the dharma. Today, he says, people travel abroad and after that travel, they go to Kashi and tonsure their heads for atonement. And he says, such double standards have ruined the country, compounded again by a hypocritical system. On molding the character of every child in the new ideal of education, Premchand observes that education system all over the world is structured to maintain the traditional social arrangement, which entails exploitation of society for self-aggrandizement. The new ideal that the education begins with from childhood, the first 5 years are crucial in shaping the future. Premchand stresses the fact that parents and family mold the child, and it is their responsibility to strengthen the character with ideal principles of universal brotherhood. In another essay on Indian literature and Pandit Nehru, in November 1935, Premchand recalls that around the same time in the issue of Hans, they were deliberating on forming the Indian Literary Association. Pandit Nehru, imprisoned in Almora jail, was meditating on the same issue independently. For Premchand, it was a serendipity that proved that the nation's thought flows swiftly and uniformly to cultural unity. Nehru urges that we must establish a link with all languages of our nation. That would promote national unity. Furthermore, our literatures must make connection with the literatures of the world, and our writers must attend international literary forums. We must all endeavor to learn many foreign languages which will serve as a window, our window to the world, through which fresh air and sunshine will flow in. Nehru makes a very valid point when he says that because of the imperial rule, we see everything with English glasses. We must read other literatures to broaden our horizons and to understand that there are more treasures in the world than just English. Lastly, and most importantly, Nehru advocates that famous novels in foreign languages should be translated into Hindi, and Premchand leaves it to the readers to reflect on these issues and to the idea of a unifying language to understand the relationship between regional languages and Hindi. He cautions that any indifference to Hindi would not be of any advantage to regional or national literature. In the essay New Era, Premchand anticipates Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, and he observes that nation is a mental inclination. When it becomes strong, then inhabitants of a region or country have an awakening of brotherhood. The present nation state is a European concept, and nationalism, he says, is a curse of the modern times. Every nation is in race for armaments and to be more powerful. The defense budget triples them. They want to end this mutual distrust. Many times there is a trade and summit for disarmament, but each time it fails. In a very simple, straightforward manner, Premchand asks a very basic question. When intentions are not pure, what will summits achieve? Nationalism has given rise to imperialism and materialism. Premchand's astute assessment in 1932 is a natural follow-up of Tagore's universal appeal. Tagore in 1908 wrote to his friend A.M. Bose, and I quote, "Patriotism can't be a final spiritual shelter. I will not buy glass for the price of diamonds, and I will not allow patriotism to triumph over humanity." Unquote. Tagore's speech on nationalism was published in 1917. His perception of nationalism has relied mainly on ancient Indian philosophy, where the world is seen as a single nest. Both Rabindranath Tagore and Premchand strongly believe that if India contributes to the world, it should do in the form of universal brotherhood, practiced by Nanak, Kabir, and Chaitanya. Writing a novel, another essay, is Premchand's erudite analysis of writers from India and abroad on the basis of plot, underlying the significance of world literature and comparative analysis. Novel writing, he writes, grew in the 14th and 15th century. Shakespeare wrote many plays based on Italian novels. In the last 50 years, most of the literary work has been in the genre of fiction. Bengal gave birth to Bankim, Gujarat to Govindas, Marathi to Apte, and Urdu to Ratannath and others. Writers must read different literatures deeply. Just as we cannot begin to write without a grounding in grammar, Premchand notes that in the same way, we are not able to overcome our shortcomings without a comparative study to broaden our intellect. Writers, he says, must be as curious as students. It is said about Francis Bacon, he notes, that he was always interested in people who had more knowledge than him. Novelists must have, Premchand says, high aspirations. As Robert Browning wrote about artists in Andrea del Sarto in the 19th century, and I quote, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for, unquote. Premchand terms John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress as an incomparable allegory. Tolstoy and Hawthorne have created inspiring and unique plots, he writes. For mystery plot, Premchand summons Arthur Conan Doyle, who was alive and writing mysteries. Reading them sharpens the mind, and Premchand feels it helps to solve life's difficult problems. In writing emotional plots, he places Tolstoy and George Eliot as supreme examples. Plots that aim for social and political reform are galore. Urdu is full of reformative writing. In the past century, many reforms have been initiated, the seeds of which were sown in the novels. Dickens, Tolstoy, Gorky, Turgenev, Balzac, Hugo, Mary Mackay. I'm so happy he mentioned Mary Mackay, known by the pen name Marie Corelli, and Zola. All eminent writers wrote primarily for reforms. Writers are the creators of their times. And Premchand says the times now are in ferment, and a sensitive thinking person cannot stand unmoved by injustice. In continuation with the genre of novel, the very next year he wrote another essay, again entitled Novel, which, though he says novel is difficult to define, but it can be called a reflection of human character. While realism opens our eyes to the paradoxical human situation, idealism transports us to another enchanting world. A novel that blends realism with idealism, Premchand says, is considered the best. Literature is not created art for art's sake, a theme close to Premchand's heart, which he would elaborate upon later. Art for art's sake happens only when a nation is prosperous. When we see that we are chained by political and social disparity, surrounded by searing images of abject poverty and suffering, how is it possible for a sensitive mind to stay unmoved? He appeals to all budding writers to not pick their pens without studying the human situation. The very first requirement is intention. Illustrating with a parable, Premchand recounts how a famous artist was once asked where he got all those beautiful colors from. The artist answered smilingly, "My mind." Again, highly recommended these two-part essays that Premchand wrote on the art of storytelling. Premchand's affinity with socially committed and purposive literature is amply evident in all his literary creations. As Professor Asauddin said, it's a porous boundary. You cannot delineate the fiction from the non-fiction writing. So this is a socially committed and purposive literature in all his writings, especially in the new emerging trends of the 1930s, when famously a group of young Turks in London drew up a manifesto which would become the Progressive Writers' Movement. Premchand wholeheartedly supported their cause and published it in his influential journal Hans in October 1935. In 1936, Progressive Writers Association at Lucknow, Premchand's presidential address, Sahitya Akademi, became a landmark of a literary movement that would shape a whole generation of writers and thinkers. Premchand began by expressing gratitude to the founders of the Hindustani language for creating a stable form to express thoughts and emotions. In those fraught times, Premchand adds a very significant point that language is a means and not an end. Literature is defined as criticism of life, and a writer with his awakened intelligence ignites a reader into the reader a spiritual joy and strength. The aim of literature is to refine the mind. हमें खूबसूरती का मयार बदलना होगा. We will have to redefine the criterion of aesthetic appreciation. In the past days of decadence, the writers subsisted on the patronage of the aristocrats and focused on their pleasure for sheer survival. Thus, the writer would fix his sight on palaces and opulence. He would never turn his attention to the poor man's hut. Literature, Premchand notes, must confront reality and inspire us to act. It should not lead us to slumber, which is a sign of death. Writer is a torch bearer, and the purpose of literature is to serve society with the spirit of freedom, aesthetic, and constructive outlook. The 14-page manifesto cautions the writers that society is their court of justice, and they are answerable to the people's court. The stirring speech is a culmination of Premchand's lifelong endeavor, wherein he expanded the scope of literature by writing evocatively about issues hitherto considered beyond the pale of literature. Despite his finest writings show the influence of Gandhi, Tolstoy, Gorky, and the Russian Revolution. It reflects the support for Sharda Bill in his choice of subjects, whether it is child marriage, widow remarriage, untouchability, travails of landless laborers, the urgent need for land reform, the ubiquitous corruption, social, class, and gender inequalities. Much like Premchand, Wole Soyinka, in the annual meeting of the Nigerian Writers Association, exhorted his colleagues to rise equal to their calling and to use their words as tools, to call attention and not to tolerate the corruption and the abuse of power, even in a democratic replacement. In the open sore of the continent, Soyinka illustrates the hardships and anguish of a nation, testified in his dismal material reality. Displaying the same fervor as expressed by Premchand, Swainka accepts his country Nigeria with a solemn oath. I quote, Nigeria, a space within which I am bound to collaborate with fellow occupants in the pursuit of justice and ethical life. Unquote. As Premchand sums up in the new era, a ray of hope is still visible in the new era. Justice and dharma is quietly gaining ground. People understand the need for peaceful revolution. India can survive only if it expands its spiritual consciousness. Till this becomes a reality, we have to work industriously. I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mini Nanda, for giving us another insight from another angle to Premchand's writing. And I'm going to request for the next presentation to be made after the introduction to the presenter, please. Thank you.
Yeah, ma'am. Our next speaker is Dr. Sahitya Akademi, who has been working as an assistant professor in the Department of English at Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. Prior to this, he was teaching at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad, in the capacity of a contractual lecturer from 2012 to 2016. He did his master's and doctorate in English from English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. His doctoral thesis was a critical discourse analysis of Mahesh Dattani's Select Plays. Dr. Shoaib Akram's area of interests includes critical linguistics, Indian English literature, cultural studies, and theory. He has presented a number of papers in national and international conferences and has a number of publications in various literary journals. Welcome, Dr. Shoaib.
Right. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
The paper which I am about to present is on Premchand's non-fiction work with special reference to his views on education. The true mark of a great writer is when his words resonate across centuries and generations. Dhanpat Rai Srivastava, popularly known as Munshi Premchand, was born in Lamhe, a village near Varanasi, on 31st July 1880. He ranks as one of the tallest figures in the field of modern Hindi and Urdu literature. Premchand was born to Ajib Rai and Anandi Devi. Premchand had a rather very difficult childhood. He had to face tremendous struggles to make his ends meet due to his parents' early demise. His mother, a home baker, passed away when he was 8 years old. 9 years later, the death of Premchand's father, who was a postal clerk, interrupted the youngster's education. To support his stepmother and half-brother, he started providing tuitions, classes to his students. Later, he also received an offer for the post of assistant teacher at Government District School in Bahraich. Around the same time, he also started writing fictions. His first pseudonym was Nawab Rai, which he used for his first novel, Asrar-e-Mabid, which focused on corruption among temple priests and exploitation of poor people. The novel was serialized in the Varanasi Urdu-based weekly, Awaz-e-Khalq, from October 1903 to February 1905. He began his literary career in Urdu, but eventually switched to writing Hindi. His first collection of short stories, Shoz-e-Watan, which came out in the year 1908, was found to be so seditious that it was banned by the imperial government and all copies were ordered to be burnt. Undaunted, Premchand kept writing stories that expressed the pain and suffering of the toiling masses that had been suppressed for centuries. He used stereotypes when necessary to make general observations, painting on a large canvas with broad, sweeping brushstrokes. Writing stories that occasionally seemed preachy or moralistic were not outright sentimental to modern readers. Premchand, popularly known as Upanyas Samrat, wrote approximately a dozen novels, around 250 short stories, numerous essays and translations. He championed the genre of novel, but during his later days, he shifted to the genre of short story and non-fictional writings. According to Premchand, novels are read by those who have money.
16
Only those
candidates
who
were called
have
by
money
interview,
have the time.
out of which
Some
14
are written for
candidates
those
accredited to
who have
14,
neither
1-4.
money nor time.
आपको 1-4 लिखना है और नाम है डॉक्टर लिया.
Right. Premchand was a writer for the masses whose choice of genre was determined by the larger social, political, and cultural circumstances. Choosing the genre of non-fiction or journalistic articles was in tune with the political and social environment of the 1930s in India. It was a turbulent time, then a politically and socially charged decade. Mahatma Gandhi had waged a war against the British. Premchand, a strong supporter of Gandhi, contributed to the struggle in his own way. He was fighting the battle in the literary arena. His journals, Hans and Jagran, served as a mouthpiece for his nationalistic views. He was influenced by the freedom movement, and his works not only entertained readers but also conveyed social messages and encouraged them to participate in the movement. He voiced his opinions freely in this medium, which he could not otherwise express. He was a keen observer of society, and his writings are a testimony to this fact. Amrit Rai says in the biography, Premchand, His Life and Times, what he enjoyed writing best in journals week after week and month after month was notes and comments on wide range of current affairs of which he had ever been a keen observer. In this privilege lay the reward, a hard-earned one, of being the editor and publisher of two papers. Premchand indulged in indirect and conscious didacticism in articles, essays, and editorials. And he wrote with a crusading energy to uplift and bring a change in the society, a change for the better. He was a columnist in, in the journal Zamana with a portion entitled The March of the Time. He viewed his profession of writing as a service to the nation. His works are reflections of his patriotism and zeal to make his country better. He considered himself to be a writer with a message, a writer with a moral obligation to rid his society of many evils which he specifically pinpointed in his articles. Unanimously elected the first president of Progressive Writers Movement body in 1936, Premchand wrote one of the finest pieces of non-fiction for this occasion. His speech, called Sahitya Akademi, was heard by an audience comprising both young and established writers from all across the country. In simple but powerful words, he told his audience how good literature can be founded on truth, beauty, freedom, and humanity. And since literature is nothing but a mirror of its age, its definition, scope, and contents, just as much as its aim and objectives, must change with time. He says, and I quote, currently good literature is judged by the sharpness of its perception, which stirs our feeling and thoughts into motion. The main aim of literature then was to refine the mind of the readers. And while undoubtedly the main aim of art was to strengthen one's sense of beauty, art too must be weighed on the same scale of usefulness as everything else in life. He further says, we will have to raise the standard of our literature so that it can serve the society more usefully. Our literature will discuss and assess every aspect of life, and we will no longer be satisfied with eating the leftovers of other languages and literatures. We will ourselves increase the capital of our literature. The didactic nature of his non-fictional writings can be understood by the fact that Premchand oscillated between his profession of writing and that of learning and teaching. He was a school teacher at the Government District School Bahraich and then at Normal High School Gorakhpur. He also served as inspector of schools for many years. His association with school and students gave him a first-hand experience of things. He understood the world of education and its relevance in the Indian society properly. His articles and essays provided him an essential platform to express his ideas and bring about a change in the educational system. His views on education and his ideas of reform in schools and universities only show his ardent love for liberty, nationalistic views, and freedom. His article, Shiksha Ka Naya Adarsh, September 3rd, 1933, in this article, he criticizes the ideals of education as they make a person selfish, self-serving, snobbish, and insensitive. He favors supportiveness and mutual trust instead of competitiveness in education. He gives primary importance to childhood as an adult personality is shaped in it. In his article, Prag Mahila Vidyapeeth Ki Sahityak Pragati, February 1936, and Prag Mahila Vidyapeeth Ki Nai Yojanaएं, in April 1936, in this article, he advocates the need for a female education. His article, Sir P.C. Rai Ka Dikshat Bhashan, December 1933, is about the need for formal education without stressing too much on the imposition of classes and strict discipline. According to P.C. Rai, classes should not be made mandatory for the students since the compulsion of acquisition of knowledge takes away its beauty. He further says that examination and imposition of classes restrict self-development of students. His another article titled Sir P.C. Rai Ka Yuvaon Ko Aadesh talks about the detrimental harmonious psychology of youngsters that by being slave to their desires, they were doing great harm to themselves as well to the nation. Premchand severely criticizes the examination system in his article Fail Hone Wale Ladke in July 1933. He argues that if the education institutes do not have the right to ensure jobs, then they have no moral right to fail students. He also holds teachers accountable for the fate of such students who fail. The failure of the students is a reflection on the personality and motivation of the teachers. He is in favor of holistic education, a system that gives importance to extracurricular activities like yoga, sports, dance, and music. He praises education institutions like Shantiniketan and Madan Pillai University in this context in his articles Dakshin Ka Shantiniketan in June 1933 and Dr. Tagore Mumbai Mein in January 1943. The importance of health is also discussed in his article titled Schoolon Mein Swasth Pariksha and Swasth Aur Shiksha. Here, Premchand talks about the lack of proper health awareness in the curriculum to be the biggest flaw of our education system. He gives more importance to the physical and mental health of students and severely criticizes the brief monthly checkup as a mere formality. Instead, this thing should be strictly focused upon and only a trained teacher can do so. Premchand's idea is not only to pinpoint the flaws in the system, but also to provide a remedy. He advocates for the ancient teaching system called the Gurukul system of education. His article, Gurukul Kandi Mein Teen Din, showcases the merits of Gurukul system of education and lives up to its role of producing more servants to the nation than any other institutions of learning. He gives importance to the concept of education from within and believes in character building, which in turn leads to nation building. By this, Premchand offers a solution to the defects of modern system. Premchand also celebrates the idea of reading. In his article, Carmichael Library Ki Hirak Jayanti, in November 1933, he goes on to give the precise number of books the library had, the number of English books, Hindi, Urdu, Sanskrit, Bengali, Gujarati, etc. The total number of magazines, journals. He believes that people can only benefit from library if it has a good collection of books along with a well-drafted catalog of all the books. He elaborates on the relevance and essence of a sound library, stating that a library that has an ample collection of old and new books and also a number of readers is the most extensive. In Ek Uchit Paramarsh, Premchand stresses on the importance of a dedicated time slot in school curriculum for extracurricular activities. He emphasizes the need for the psychological development of the students. Extracurricular activities are in no way less important than subjects like mathematics and geography. The only hurdle in the path being the lack of competent teachers for the said subjects. His article Sanyukt Prant Mein Shiksha Ka Prachar in May 1933, he uses empirical data from the education census of 1931 to discuss the growth of education among men, women through the perspective of gender and religion. He also provides his readers with a detailed list of average literacy rate in different provinces of the time. The kind of knowledge that Premchand imparts through his non-fictional writing could not have been possible in any other medium like novels and short stories, where preaching would not have been possible. The issue in his articles have a bearing of contemporary society. It is not long before that Premchand's worldview was formed by his novels and short stories and not by his non-fictional writings. His journalistic writings and essays have been sadly neglected for long. But now we do have translations of his non-fictional writings also coming. Criticism and research is still in scarcity now. Researchers are yet to delve deep into the realm of his non-fiction. Hopefully, with many such talks as the current one, Premchand would soon bridge gap between his fictional and non-fictional work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ikram. And I'm hoping that Professor Trivedi will be able to join us now. Can we try once again to see if he would be audible? Doesn't matter if we can't get the visual, but if we can just hear him, I think that would be great. So could you try, please?
Yes, intermittently we have been trying, but he is still not there now.
So what do you suggest?
It's a huge disappointment, in fact.
Personally, I was really looking forward to what he had to say.
Yes, of course.
I know. So I'm just keeping my fingers crossed and hoping that he'll be able to join.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you just try it once again, please? Thank you. Do you think he could possibly phone in on WhatsApp maybe? And we could just listen to him?
I'm now trying to call him up. Just a minute.
Okay. Any success?
Yes, ma'am, I talked to him, but he kept on trying, and until now, no success, unfortunately. Some connectivity problem, and that couldn't be helped. We can understand that. He asked us to go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So shall we assume that he will not be joining us, which is extremely
Yeah. Now he told me.
Okay, so I wish to begin with many thanks to our presenters. And I must acknowledge that it was a great pleasure to be here today because I think Sahitya I have to thank for getting so many of us together with whom I have shared my literary journey. Professor Asaduddin, who's a department colleague, and he was my senior at Aligarh Muslim University during our master's courses. I'm really happy to meet online my friends and fellow academics like Professor Malti Mathur and Dr. Mini Nanda. We share the same college from where we have done our graduation. And also making a new friend and a young colleague, Dr. Shoaib Ikram. And I'm really, really happy because all our presenters today gave us different facets. One thing which I will always feel sorry about is the fact that Professor Harish Trivedi was not able to join us, because he's been a friend and a very special kind of mentor as far as I'm concerned, because our department had the translation project on Premchand's works, and he's been of immense help and advice and mentoring for this particular project. I do hope that you will find an occasion sometime, Krishna ji, to have him speak, and I'd love to hear what he says. So thank you to all the presenters. And I think the purpose of this seminar has been fulfilled very greatly, because each of the presenters that we had, and we had 4 of them, they presented a different facet of Premchand's writing. Professor Asaduddin began, and I thought he made this very pertinent linkage between Premchand's fiction and his non-fiction, especially by reading out that opening paragraph of a text where the usage of the words like Rahasya and Muamma, they suggest the coming together of Hindi and Urdu in the idiom that Premchand had adopted. And it shows how Premchand had an equal felicity with the idioms of these 2 different languages. In Professor Malti Mathur's presentation, what stood out was her focus on Premchand's letters, his correspondence. And it was an interesting pointer to the fact that she spoke of him in 3 avatars: Ganpat Rai, Premchand, and Sampadak Premchand. So it's interesting, to see how these different, as I say, avatars, they contribute to the thematic thrust of the text that she mentioned. The third presentation was by Dr. Mini Nanda, and her focus was on Premchand's idealistic realism, which is very clear in his fiction. But what was the facet that made Dr. Nanda's presentation very interesting was the fact that she grounded it in the political and historical undertones of the times, and also brought out the richness of Premchand's creative imagination as a figure who was very familiar with writers from the world over, and his vast reading of these writers. The 4th presentation, another facet entirely on Premchand, which was on his views on education. And we had Dr. Ikram looking at the ferment of the freedom struggle, the realities of Premchand's personal life, which were reflected in his views on education, on institutions that build education, and also on how Premchand not only points to what could be the possible flaws or the missing elements in the educational project of that time, but also remedies that he suggested. So all in all, it's been a very interesting kind of an overview, the thematic thrust and the critical pointers that our presenters had to give regarding this particular seminar that had to do with non-fiction prose of Premchand. I see that we have a little bit of time. So I'm going to take a bit of liberty as the chair to just talk about some of the central ideas that emerge in Premchand's non-fiction works, specifically focusing on literature and literary culture. And I'd like to begin by saying that all the presentations have brought out the fact that Premchand's writing can be seen as a map or a geography of his mind, which has been shaped by his experiences in life, shaped by his reading, and by his familiarity with Indian as well as Western works. And therefore, I am again forced to look back on the kind of publication that has been undertaken for Premchand's non-fiction writing. We've had publications which have tried to cluster together, thematically cluster together, various pieces of non-fiction writing as belonging to broad rubrics like nationalism, like religion, like literature, like humor, like autobiographies. But for any writer, there is a lot of intersection in the works, and it's very difficult and perhaps not very appropriate to label a writer's works as belonging to one generic thematic thrust. So, as someone who's done a little bit of translation of Premchand, I would just like to highlight my own perspectives that I have gleaned from translating and reading Premchand. One idea that struck me as interesting is the fact that he says that literature is a tussle between truth and untruth. And he defines what truth is. He says truth is a shared objective of faith and science. And both seek truth through the route of reason. And I thought this is just such a wonderful kind of quick definition of truth, because all of us live at the times of what is post-truth or personal truth. And therefore, Premchand talks about progressive literature, where he says that a premium should be laid on mankind's spaces rather than God's spaces. So it's a very specific thrust that he has in mind in a couple of his essays, non-fiction works, where he talks about truth and fiction. And he makes it very clear that a progressive milieu has to be evolved, in which the freedom of thought and expression are of primary presence and concern. Another thing which has Premchand talking about a reality which perhaps still finds relevance has to do with him bemoaning the fact that the periodical scenario in our literatures, I should say, from within our land is rather grim. And he makes very often a case for periodicals and journals to have a serious critical edge to what is being written. He also talks about the concept of Indian literature, if I may say so, and makes it very clear that Indian literature has to include writers from what he says are the provinces, because we are looking at undivided India under colonial rule. And so he suggests what now Sahitya is doing, bringing literatures from various regional languages into a central focus and under a central rule, a kind of central linguistic administration, if I may use the word. So in that sense, he's had the foresight of writing this. And he does refer to Nehru and Gandhi, especially in terms of what they had to say about literature from the provinces as they were known. Then on fiction, he has this interesting suggestion that fiction for him is a confluence of imitation and originality. And he suggests that the objective of fiction for him has been reformative as well as entertaining. These are two things which have guided him in whatever he's written. And interestingly, he talks about Charlie Chaplin in one of his essays. And he says that films can never hope to capture the fluidity of languages. And I thought that is a very interesting idea, because very often we don't think of Premchand and Chaplin together. So it just goes to show how broad his canvas of awareness, reading, and even seeing films was. Then on poetry, and as I said, just very central ideas. There are many, and I'd be probably reading another paper if I went into details. But on poetry, he says that our poetry, and he's writing this in 1936, which is towards the end of his life. He says that our poetry has wasted centuries on bemoaning the separation of lovers or a heartless beloved. But he sees a lot of hope when he looks at a poet like Allama Iqbal of the Sare Jahan Se Acha fame, controversial figure today. But he looks at Iqbal's Farman-e-Khuda and says that this is a work which has infused what Premchand says is life into the dead bones of poetry. So another interesting perception of another genre of literature, away from his fiction writing, from his novel writing and short stories. Then Premchand has very interesting perspectives to give on language and idiom. And when I say language and idiom, I'm only going to talk about, the Hindi-Urdu linkage, which our presenters also spoke about, because Hindi wants to claim him and Urdu also wants to claim him. But let's see what Premchand has to say. And this is what he says. He says that he sees a national language coming into being, and his conception of a language, a national language, is the Hindi-Hindustani fusion, which means that his understanding of Hindustani, the term that he uses, is the Hindi-Urdu connect. And he says these are not disconnected tongues. He describes them, and I've translated it as two sisters, one body, but two faces. So this is what he has to say about Hindi-Urdu. So this whole discourse, which has been, claiming a writer, tearing apart whatever he has written, I think is put to rest in his own views on the idiom of language. He also refers to Hindustani Dakhini, the Urdu of the South. And he says, this is corrupted Hindustani. So there is this constant reiteration of Hindustani. And in one of his essays, he even says Urdu is a form of Hindi. So he talks about Hindi serving as a link languages with works in other languages to be brought out in Hindi. And he says this will give life to languages, make them living languages. And a very interesting idea that he has floated in one of his essays is something which, on our West, Turkey practices, and on the East, Malaysia practices, which is the Indo-Roman script. He says, evolve your Indo-Roman script. Have your literatures written in English, but Romanized. And I thought that is a suggestion which perhaps needs to be seriously taken up. And he makes it very clear that Hindi cannot be, and I underline cannot be, the national language simply on the basis of translation. Makes it very clear that translation is not the only channel for Hindi to become a national language, after having what he has said about other languages coming under one roof. And of course, the Indo-Roman script that has to be evolved. Then he offers certain very interesting socio-historical perspectives that have to do with the British Raj during which he is living. He also has a very clear and a very critical view on what he says is Brahmanvad, where he says that, the establishment of an organization like the Varna Ashram Swarajya Sangh is something which totally contravenes the governance that should prevail in our country, because, and this is what I've translated it as, the nation should respect all faiths and inspire national harmony. For him, this is governance. So it's a very interesting kind of definition of what the term governance is, because we've had reference to it many times in our contemporary life. Another very interesting contrast that Premchand makes is between the idea of nationhood, which he says is a harmonious bond of cultures, and nationalism, which he says implies confrontation. And he says nationalism is not possible at all if the spirit of nationhood doesn't exist. So he makes a very clear kind of a distinction between nationhood and nationalism in one of his essays. And we can see him perhaps as a Marxist when he writes in another essay about his worldview. He says that the world is filled with a ruling class, and I quote, of capitalists and imperialists who control military, parliament, and bureaucracy, while masses struggle to survive this onslaught, unquote. So here is Premchand's worldview. And he bemoans our national fabric when he suggests that we are, and I quote from his essay as shackled by bigotry and sectarianism, a deadly divisive tendency. So here is Premchand's worldview, also incorporating his vision of his own times. Premchand, I also see as a man who has given suggestions regarding the impetus that can be given to literary creativity. For example, he says there need to be literary clubs in towns as much as in cities. He talks about the need for encouragement of student readership of the literature being produced within the country, a very rich harvest, as he says. He calls for 3 specific institutionalized ways of giving impetus to literary creativity. He calls for a Bharatiya Pustakalaya Sangh, or a national organization for libraries. He talks about a Sarvdeshik Sahitya Sanstha, which is, I think, foreseeing Sahitya Akademi. He talks about the Hindi Lekhak Sangh, which is for the well-being of writers in Hindi or Hindustani, because for him, Hindi was, this confluence of Urdu and Hindi as Hindustani. And another important perspective that any good literature should have is the literary criticism that has to emanate from studies of literature. So he does mention that literature in his own time suffers from a serious lack of critics and critical perspectives. And he talks about salacious literature in his own time, which has become very popular, and how this salacious literature is being plagiarized. He gives an example of this story, and I'm quoting it because the title is very suggestive. Sohag Raat, one written by Acharya Dwivedi, which is the salacious version, and another written by Pandit Krishnakant, which is a very different and perhaps a very opposite kind of representation. Then Premchand, an entire essay is devoted to an Urdu writer's critical assessment of a story. This is Rashidul Khairi's Hayat-e-Saleha, where he talks about this particular work in terms of the pluses or the positives, saying that it represents class mentality, it problematizes the dynamics of womanhood, not feminism, and it has subtle pointers for social reform. These are 3 things, he says, in his view, are very essential for good literature. And he sees Khairi's Hayat-e-Salma as falling within this. He also critiques it, saying that it is a story which is rooted in the Muslim locale and a Muslim milieu. And that is why it tends to be inward looking rather than outward looking. But at the same time, within his critique of Ferry's work, he brings out his knowledge of Islamic history, which was also mentioned by one of the presenters, saying that there was a golden age which symbolized a truly progressive world in thought and deed as far as this Muslim representation and Islamic history went. So Premchand has these different facets as a writer of non-fiction. And I know that unfortunately in our world of academics and in the world in general, the name Premchand conjures the image of a very powerful writer of stories and novels. And a lesser number think of him as a man of literature whose critical impulse was perhaps as strong as his creative impulse. And I think I'm so happy that Sahitya has taken up this particular conflation, the critical impulse and the creative impulse. And I hope that you'll be doing a little more work in this area. We must appreciate that Premchand's views are based on his literary pluralism, if I may use the term, his vast reading of classical and contemporary writing from spaces as far away as Britain, America, Europe, and France and Russia, and the fact that he can talk about humor from Amir Khusro to Birbal to Charlie Chaplin. It's a very interesting trajectory that he makes. So I would suggest, and in my mind, I believe that Premchand is building a very significant canonical framework for Indian writing and its reception. And I think this has been brought out very, very fruitfully and powerfully in today's presentations, which have made a very cogent case for attention to Premchand's non-fiction writing. And I think a seminar's success is measured in terms of how forward-looking it is. And I think that younger academics, given what Premchand has to say about literature, which is what I have focused on, our younger academics need not look westward for literary study. There is so much that they can evolve from opinions that lie within our land. So I'm going to just say thank you once again to the presenters, because you have built up a case for a Premchand study area in literary studies. I also want to thank Sahitya for taking the first steps in this direction. A Premchand studies sphere for academicians. And I have to thank you for bringing this to a forum like this. My thanks also go out to Krishnaji and Varmaji at the Sahitya Akademi for providing this platform, for facilitating our interface today, and for allowing us to craft possible blueprints, and I underline this, craft possible blueprints for future Premchand studies. I wish to thank all the presenters because I have been enriched with the variety of facets that have been presented, and I will really regret the fact that Professor Harish Trivedi could not join us. So thank you, presenters, my friends, my colleagues, and my new friend, and Sahitya for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much, and I will say goodbye.
So finally, thanks a lot to Shoaib Akram, Mini Nandaji, Malati Mathurji, Saduddin sir, and the chair, Amina ma'am. Thanks all for getting together and sharing your views on Premchand. Let us together look forward to listening to Professor Harish Trivedi also soon on Premchand. So for now, I heartily thank all of you on behalf of Sahitya. Thanks a lot.